The wheat was gone. Every last golden stalk of it, every promise Augusta Keene had poured her blood and her grief, and her last remaining hope into, lay flattened and rotting against the cracked Oklahoma earth, soaked black by the freak August hailstorm that had swept down from the northern plains without a single word of warning. 3 weeks before harvest. 3 weeks. She had been counting the days like a woman counting the beats of her own failing heart, and now there was nothing left to count. The storm had stolen everything. She stood at the edge of the field with her hands hanging loose at her sides, her sun-darkened fingers trembling, her boots sinking into mud that smelled of ruin. The morning light was the kind of cruel, indifferent gold that made destroyed things look almost beautiful, and Augusta hated it for that. She hated the sky for being clear now. She hated the birdsong starting up in the cottonwood trees along the creek, cheerful and oblivious. She hated the silence of the land itself, the vast, breathing indifference of this Oklahoma territory that had swallowed her husband's life 2 years ago and was now, apparently, determined to swallow everything else. The sob that came out of her was not a gentle thing. It was not the soft, dignified weeping of a woman in a parlor. It was raw and ugly and enormous, the kind of sound that comes from the deepest chamber of a person when the last wall finally gives way. She pressed her hand over her mouth, but it did not help. The sound came anyway, shaking through her chest and shoulders, bending her forward at the waist until she was nearly doubled over, her dark hair falling loose from its pins and curtaining her face. She did not hear Wallace Dalton come up behind her. She did not hear his boots in the mud, did not hear him stop. She simply became aware through the raw haze of her grief that someone was standing beside her, not touching her, not speaking, just there. A steady, solid presence at her left shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his arm through the cool morning air. She did not turn to look at him. She could not have explained, even to herself, why that was the thing that undid her entirely. Not the ruined wheat, not the debt she owed the bank in Guthrie, not the 2 years of relentless, grinding, solitary struggle. It was this, a man who did not offer words, a man who simply stayed beside her. She wept harder and he remained. That was where everything truly began, though the road that had brought them both to that ruined field on the morning of August the 17th, in the year 1893, was long and tangled, and full of the kind of secrets that the wide Oklahoma territory seemed particularly good at keeping. Augusta Keene had arrived in the Oklahoma territory in the spring of 1891. 6 months after the land run of '89 had already settled the best claims, which meant she and her husband, Thomas Keene, had purchased their parcel outright from a man named Orrin Stroud who had claimed it in the run, and then decided, after one brutal winter, that he wanted nothing more to do with the frontier. Thomas had paid $400 for 160 acres of raw prairie, a one-room sod house, and a well that needed redug. He had called it opportunity. Augusta had looked at the flat, wind-scraped horizon and called it courage, because she had been determined to believe in the life her husband was building for them. Thomas Keene had been a good man and a terrible farmer. He had come from Ohio with big hands and bigger dreams, and absolutely no practical knowledge of how to coax wheat from semi-arid plains soil, how to read the signs of a dry summer in the curl of the grass in June, how to manage a team of work horses on land that seemed to actively resist the plow. He had learned, slowly and stubbornly, with Augusta beside him every step, and by the summer of 1892, they had 40 acres planted and a real chance of making back what they had spent. The fever had come in October. It had swept through the settlement like a dark whisper, touching one family and then another, and Thomas Keene, who had always been one of those men who believed that hard work was a sufficient defense against almost any misfortune, had gone to bed on a Tuesday evening complaining of a headache and had never risen from it. He was gone by the following Sunday, at 31 years of age, and Augusta Keene, 26 years old, alone in the Oklahoma Territory with a one-room sod house and 40 acres, and a debt on the property note that was due the following spring, had buried him under the single old elm tree at the eastern edge of the property, and then gone inside and spent 3 days unable to speak. Then she had gotten up. That was the thing about Augusta Keene that people in the nearby settlement of Caldwell Crossing did not fully understand when they looked at her. This quiet, dark-haired woman who walked into town once a week with her list written on a folded piece of paper, and her chin set at an angle that discouraged casual pity. They did not understand that the stillness in her was not coldness. It was the stillness of a person who had already passed through something enormous and come out the other side carrying it quietly, the way a river carries its depth beneath its surface. She was not finished grieving Thomas. She did not think she would ever be fully finished. But grief and work were not incompatible, and the land did not care about her sorrow. The wheat needed planting. The horses needed feeding. The note needed paying. She had survived the winter of 1892 alone, taking on laundry for the Caldwell Crossing families who could afford to pay someone else to do it, preserving everything her kitchen garden produced, hunting with Thomas's old Winchester rifle with a competence that surprised everyone except herself. She had paid half the note in April and negotiated the remainder with the bank in Guthrie, and she had planted wheat that spring with a hired hand named Reuben Gray, who was 63 years old and knew Oklahoma soil the way he knew his own name. Reuben Gray was the one who had first mentioned Wallace Dalton. It had been an evening in late May, the two of them sitting on the narrow porch of the sod house watching the sun go down behind the western ridge, Augusta with a cup of coffee and Reuben with his pipe, and Reuben had said, the way he said most things, which was sideways and without preamble, that the Dalton place to the north had been sold. Augusta had asked who bought it. Reuben had said a man named Wallace Dalton, no relation to the outlaw Daltons who had come to their infamous end in Coffeyville the previous fall. A distinction, Reuben noted, that Wallace himself was apparently quite particular about establishing early in any new acquaintance. He had come down from Kansas, where he had worked as a foreman on a cattle outfit near Dodge City for 7 years. He had saved his money and purchased the Harlan property, 320 acres with a creek running through the northern quarter, and a frame house that was, by local standards, almost aggressively well built. Augusta had said that was interesting and gone inside to start supper, and she had not thought about Wallace Dalton again for several weeks. She met him for the first time at the general store in Caldwell Crossing on a Thursday morning in June. She was selecting calico fabric for a repair to the curtains in the sod house when she became aware of a man at the counter discussing the price of barbed wire fencing with the storekeeper, Carl Hess, in a voice that was quiet and certain, the voice of a man who knew exactly what things were worth and was prepared to wait until he got that price. She had glanced over without meaning to and then looked away quickly because looking at Wallace Dalton felt, for reasons she could not immediately identify, like looking directly into the sun. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, though he did not look much past 32 or 33. His face was weathered and angular, the kind of face that the Oklahoma wind and sun carved rather than damaged, and there was a quality of absolute self-possession about him, a man who occupied exactly the amount of space he needed and no more, that Augusta, whose own survival for the past year had been built on that same precise economy of self, recognized with an instinctive, almost physical jolt. He had turned and seen her looking at him before she could properly look away. She had turned back to the calico with a composure she was somewhat proud of. He had not said anything. But when she brought her fabric to the counter to settle her account, he had stepped aside without being asked, simply and naturally, creating space, and Carl Hess had introduced them with the cheerful efficiency of a man who considered himself the social hub of the entire settlement. Wallace Dalton had said it was a pleasure to meet her. Augusta had said the same. Their hands had not touched. He had held the door for her when she left, and she had thanked him without meeting his eyes, and she had walked to her wagon and driven the 3 miles home with an odd, uncomfortable awareness prickling at the back of her neck that she did not examine too closely. Reuben Gray, when she had told him about the encounter that evening, had smiled into his pipe smoke in a way that Augusta had chosen to find irritating rather than meaningful. The summer of 1893 had started well. The wheat came up strong, 45 acres of it, green and vigorous, bending beautifully in the summer wind. Augusta had taken to walking the edges of the field in the mornings before the heat came on, watching the progress of the grain with a feeling that she recognized, somewhat cautiously, as hope. Real hope, not the grim, determined kind that had gotten her through the winter, but the warmer, more vulnerable kind that believed good things might actually be possible. Wallace Dalton had appeared at her property line for the first time in early July. He had not come to the door. He had come to fix the shared fence line between his northern boundary and her southern one, a stretch of deteriorating post and wire fencing that technically divided their properties and had been sagging badly for at least 2 seasons. Augusta had looked up from the kitchen garden to see him working methodically along the fence line with a post driver and new wire, alone, in the high summer heat, and something in her chest had shifted in a way that she did not want to think about too carefully. She had brought him water. It was, she told herself, simply a reasonable thing to do. The man was working on a boundary fence that benefited her property as much as his. Bringing water was neighborly courtesy and nothing more. He had taken the tin cup from her with both hands, the way a man takes something he intends to handle carefully, and said thank you in that quiet, certain voice. She had stood in the sun for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching him examine the next section of fence, and then she had gone back inside and found something urgent to do in the far corner of the kitchen. They had talked properly for the first time that evening, when he was packing up his tools, and she had come out to inspect the finished fence line with the express purpose of offering fair payment for the materials he had used. He had said the materials were his contribution to a boundary that benefited them both equally, and he would not hear of payment. She had said that was generous, but she was not in the habit of accepting charity. He had looked at her directly then, without any kind of apology or evasion in his expression, and said that it was not charity, it was neighboring, and that those were different things. Augusta had thought about that distinction for several days afterward. They began to talk regularly after that. He would appear along the fence line on some pretext or another, and she would be working in the kitchen garden or coming back from the wheat field, and they would exchange words through the wire about the weather and the soil and the temperament of their respective workhorses. And gradually, those conversations expanded into longer ones, and then into ones that happened when he had no pretext at all. When he simply rode to the edge of the property and dismounted, and they stood in the evening light and talked about things that had nothing to do with fence lines or wheat prices. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, not all at once but through repeated traversal. He had grown up in eastern Kansas, the second son of a farm family that had struggled perpetually with debt and dry years. He had left at 17, not from indifference to his family, but from the pragmatic recognition that a second son on an already struggling farm was one mouth too many. He had worked cattle for 15 years, first as a hired hand and then as a foreman, and he had been saving for his own land since he was 19 years old. He was 33 now. He had waited 14 years for this place. He did not talk about why he had never married. Augusta did not ask. She was not, she reminded herself, in a position to ask that kind of question. She was a widow of less than 2 years, a woman with a property note and 45 acres of wheat, and absolutely no business letting the warmth in a man's dark eyes mean anything at all to her. She asked him once in the second week of July whether he found the solitude of the territory difficult. He had considered the question for a long moment, which was characteristic of him, that unwillingness to answer quickly just because a quick answer was available. And then he said that he had spent most of his adult life surrounded by men and noise and constant activity, and that he had found the solitude of this land to be something closer to what he had needed than he had known how to say. He said it quietly, as if it was something he had not said aloud before. Augusta had understood exactly what he meant, in a way that she had not been able to explain to a single other person in her life in the territory. Not Reuben Gray, not the women from the settlement who occasionally stopped by with their genuine but slightly suffocating concern, not even in the letters she wrote to her sister back in Columbus, Ohio. The solitude of this land was enormous and honest, and it asked nothing of you except that you be equal to it. She had looked at him and said yes. She understood that, and something in his expression had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in a way that she had carried with her for the rest of that evening like an object found unexpectedly in a coat pocket. Reuben Gray had his second heart episode in the last week of July, and was ordered by the doctor in Guthrie to rest completely for at least 6 weeks, which meant he had gone to stay with his daughter's family in Caldwell Crossing, leaving Augusta alone with the wheat and 5 weeks to harvest. She had not asked Wallace for help. She had managed on her own, checking the field daily, fighting a brief infestation of aphids on the eastern quarter with a sulfur solution she mixed herself, tracking the grain's progress toward ripeness with the focused intensity of a woman who understood in her bones that this harvest was not simply about wheat but about everything. The property note, another year on this land, the life she was building in Thomas Keene's memory and beyond it. Wallace had helped anyway, not in a way she could object to. He had simply added her fields to his own daily rounds, mentioned casually when he thought the eastern quarter was recovering well from the aphids, pointed out a drainage issue along the lower end of the field that she would not have noticed until it was too late, helped her drag a plowshare back to the equipment shed when it threw a wheel pin on a Tuesday afternoon, and she was struggling with it alone in the heat. He did these things without ceremony, and without keeping any kind of account of them, and Augusta had found herself in the increasingly complicated position of being deeply grateful and deeply unsettled by that gratitude in equal measure. Because she was beginning to understand that what she felt when she saw Wallace Dalton riding along her fence line in the evening light was not simple gratitude. It was not simple anything. It was a feeling she recognized from 14 years ago, when she had been 18 years old, and Thomas Keene had appeared in her father's store in Columbus with mud on his boots and a grin that knew too much about its own charm. And she had felt, with complete and terrifying clarity, that this man was going to change her life. The difference was that she was 28 years old now, not 18, and she knew what it cost to love someone in a place like this, knew with specific, personal knowledge how vast the bill could be. She was not afraid of love. She was afraid of what came after. She was thinking about this on the morning of August the 17th, when she woke before dawn to the sound that any farmer in the Oklahoma Territory came to dread above almost all others. Not the slow percussion of a rain that builds gently, but the sudden, violent hammering of hailstones on the sod-house roof, hard and fast and relentless, the sound of something being destroyed. She had pressed her hand flat against the wall and listened and known, with the particular horror of a person who has been here before in their imagination, so many times that the actual moment feels simultaneously shocking and inevitable, that the wheat was gone. The storm lasted 40 minutes. Then it stopped as abruptly as it had started, the way the territory's violence always did, without apology and without aftermath, leaving the morning sky clean and the land ruined beneath it. She had walked out to the field in the first gray light of dawn and stood at the edge of it and looked at what remained, which was almost nothing, and the sob had come out of her before she could prevent it, enormous and ugly and complete. And then Wallace Dalton was beside her. She had not heard him come. She would wonder afterward how he had gotten there so quickly, and later she would understand that he had seen the storm from his own place, and had saddled and ridden in the dark before it had even properly ended. Driven by an urgency he had probably not examined any more carefully than she had been examining her feelings about him. He was simply there at her left shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm. He did not speak. He did not put his hand on her shoulder. He did not offer the words that people offer in these moments, the terrible, well-meaning words that are really about the speaker's discomfort with witness of grief rather than the griever's need. He said nothing. He stood beside her in the ruined field in the early morning light while she wept, and he remained, and the remaining was the thing. Augusta cried for a long time. She did not keep track of how long. She cried for the wheat, and she cried for the note on the property that she did not know how she would service now, and she cried for the 2 years of grinding solitary effort, and she cried for Thomas, gone and buried under the elm tree, and she cried for the particular cruelty of hope, that it insists on returning even after you have done everything in your power to keep yourself safe from it. She cried, and Wallace stood beside her, and the morning light moved over the ruined field, and the cottonwood trees along the creek kept their cheerful, indifferent song. When she finally straightened, she did not feel better exactly, but she felt emptied out in the way that allows the breath to come back properly. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and then let them fall, and she turned and looked at him. He was watching her, not with the awkward, slightly panicked expression of a man who has been forced to witness female emotion against his will, but with a directness that was also, unmistakably, a kind of tenderness. He held her gaze without flinching from it. She said, in a voice that came out rougher than she intended, that she did not know what she was going to do. He said quietly that they would figure it out. The word they sat between them in the morning air for a moment, large and fragile and entirely unambiguous, and Augusta looked at him and he looked at her, and something shifted between them that was irreversible, the way the shift of a river is irreversible once the bank gives way, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Then she said she supposed they had better look at what the storm had left, and he said yes, and they walked into the field together. What the storm had left was depressing, but not absolutely nothing. The lower eastern quarter, which was the part closest to the creek and had been slightly more sheltered by the tree line, had perhaps 15% of its yield intact, damaged but not entirely destroyed. It would not service the note. It would not even come close, but it was something. Wallace walked the field methodically beside her, not pretending the picture was better than it was and not dramatizing the damage either, just looking at what was there with the same clear-eyed, straightforward assessment he brought to everything. He said that the intact portion in the eastern quarter could be cut within the week if she moved quickly. He said that the rest, the flattened stalks, could be plowed under immediately and would improve the soil quality for next year's planting. He said next year. Augusta heard the 2 words and felt something in her chest that was not quite hope yet, but was the space where hope had been and might return to. She said that the note payment was due to the bank in Guthrie in 6 weeks, that the partial harvest would not cover it, that she had perhaps $40 in reserve, and the payment required $260. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the eastern quarter, and then he said that he had had a very good year with his cattle, that the spring sale in Kansas City had come in above what he had expected, and that he had the money for the note and was prepared to lend it to her on whatever terms suited her. Augusta went very still. The territory was full of stories about loans. She had heard every variation. The man who lent money to a widow and then claimed the property when she could not repay. The settler who had taken a loan from the land company and found the terms were not what he had understood them to be. She had spent 2 years being very careful about what she owed to whom and in what amounts, because she had understood from the beginning that a woman alone on the frontier was considered by certain kinds of men to be an opportunity rather than a person. She turned and looked at Wallace directly and asked him what he expected in return. He met her gaze without any flicker of offense or evasion. He said he expected her to repay the loan when she was able, at no interest, on whatever schedule she determined, and that the terms would be written down and signed in front of witnesses at Karl Hess's store so that they were clear and unambiguous, and she need never wonder about his intentions regarding them. Augusta studied his face for a long moment. She had become, in 2 years of solitary survival, an extremely good reader of men. She had learned to identify, quickly and without benefit of the doubt, the particular quality of a man whose generosity was a form of control. She did not find that quality in Wallace Dalton's face. What she found was something she had been looking at for 2 months without letting herself name it. It was a man who cared about her in a way that had nothing to do with what she owed him. She said she would think about it. He said that was entirely reasonable. They walked back out of the field to where his horse was standing at the fence post, and he mounted, and he looked down at her in the morning light with an expression she did not know how to read entirely, and he said he was sorry about the wheat. Not in the way people say it when they mean nothing by it. In the way a person says it when they mean that they have been sitting with your particular kind of loss, and they understand its precise weight. Augusta said thank you. He rode back north toward his property, and she stood at the fence and watched him go, and then she went inside and made coffee and sat with it at the table for a long time, looking at the wood grain of the tabletop Thomas had made with his own hands in their first winter here, and she thought about what it meant that the word they had felt, when Wallace spoke it this morning, like a door opening. She thought about it for 3 days. She walked her property every morning. She cut the surviving wheat in the eastern quarter with the small hired crew she paid in meals and a daily rate she could barely afford, and she watched the rest of the ruined field and thought. She went to Thomas's grave under the elm tree in the evenings, not because she believed Thomas could hear her, but because speaking aloud in a place where she had been fully known felt different from speaking into the ordinary air. She told him about the storm. She told him about Wallace Dalton and the loan and the word they. She thought she knew, or had tried to know, or had been hoping she did not know, what Thomas would have said. On the 4th day after the storm, she saddled her mare and rode north to the Dalton property. It was the first time she had been to his place, though she had seen the frame house from a distance, white-painted and solider than anything else in the area, sitting on a slight rise with the creek visible behind it and a good barn to the east. She rode up the track to the front of the house and dismounted, and Wallace appeared around the corner of the barn with a wrench in his hand and a look on his face that was, for a fraction of a second, so unguarded in its pleasure at seeing her that Augusta had to look at her horse's neck for a moment to collect herself. She told him she would accept the loan. She said she wanted it written down as he had suggested, and she wanted the repayment terms to be not longer than 2 years and with a first payment due by the following spring harvest. She said she wanted no ambiguity. He said those terms suited him entirely. She said then there was one more thing she needed to say, and she looked at him directly, because she was not a woman who had ever managed to be anything other than direct once she had decided to be, and she said that she had been trying, for the past 2 months, not to feel what she was feeling, and she had found she was not very good at it, and she thought it was honest to tell him that. There was a silence in which the creek could be heard faintly, and the horses on his west pasture moved along the fence line. Wallace set the wrench down on the top of the fence post beside him with the deliberate care of a man making sure he had both hands free, and then he looked at her and said that he had been trying the same thing, and that he was equally poor at it. Augusta felt the door open further. She rode home that afternoon in the strange, trembling, slightly terrified lightness of a person who has said a true thing and found it received. The land looked different in the late afternoon light, the ruined field and the surviving eastern quarter and the elm tree on the rise and the sod house with its low, dark walls. It looked like hers. It looked like a place that had a future. They did not rush. That was the thing she would always remember about those weeks after the storm, the way they moved into whatever they were becoming with a deliberate slowness that was not hesitation but respect. Respect for what she had been through, and for what he had been through, and for the fact that this land, this territory, this life they were both building, was too serious and too hard and too real to be treated carelessly. He came to help with the post-harvest work, the plowing under of the ruined crop and the soil preparation for winter wheat, and they worked side by side through the long September days, and in the evenings they sat on the narrow porch of the sod house and talked as the sun went down. They talked about everything. About their families, his in eastern Kansas and hers in Columbus. About the territory and what they thought it would become when Oklahoma reached statehood, which people were already saying was coming within the decade. About the particular quality of the light in October when it comes low and gold across the flat prairie. About books, because it turned out they had both read widely despite their respective circumstances, and discovering this about each other felt like finding a hidden room in a familiar house. He told her about the dark past he carried regarding his family's debt in Kansas, how his father had lost their farm to a land company when Wallace was 15 years old, how the family had been broken apart by it, his older brother going one way and his parents another, and Wallace himself choosing the road, because the road at least had no landlord. She heard in this story the reason he had saved for 14 years for his own land, the reason the ownership of a place was not simply an economic fact to him, but a thing of almost fierce emotional necessity. She told him about the early years of her marriage, the good ones and the frightened ones, the particular loneliness of being a woman in a strange place with a husband who was brave and loving and thoroughly in over his head. She told him about the October the fever came. She told him about the 3 days she had spent unable to speak. She told him about getting up on the 4th day and going to feed the horses because the horses did not know she was broken and she could not bear for them to go hungry on her account. He listened to all of it the way he had stood beside her in the ruined field, with a complete, undemonstrative attention that felt, to Augusta, like being received. She kissed him first. It was a Wednesday evening in late September, the harvest fully in, and the fields plowed under and the first real cold of the fall beginning to sharpen the night air. They had been sitting on the porch with coffee, and he had said something about the coming winter and what he expected the wheat prices would do in the spring, and she had turned to look at him in the last of the evening light, and the thing that had been building between them for 4 months, for longer perhaps, since that first morning in Carl Hess's store, had simply become larger than the space she was trying to keep it in. She leaned forward and kissed him once, quietly, and then sat back. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately to herself, and then he said her name, Augusta, just that, in the quiet certain voice that was entirely his own, and he kissed her back with a care and an intention that made her feel, in a way she had not felt in a very long time seen. After that, things moved differently. Not quickly, exactly, but with the particular momentum of something that has been held back long enough and now goes where it was always going. He asked to call on her formally, which made her laugh not unkindly, because the formality of it in the context of months of mud and fence work and tears over ruined wheat felt both sweet and slightly absurd. She said she thought they might be a little past the formal calling stage. He said he was aware of that, but that he would like to do it properly anyway, and she found, to her own surprise, that she wanted that too. The asking and the being asked. The ceremony of intention. She had not expected to find she still cared about those things. He called on her formally on the first Sunday in October, arriving at the sod house in a clean shirt with his hair combed, and a bunch of late-season prairie flowers that he had apparently spent considerable effort finding, because the prairie in October is not particularly forthcoming with flowers. She had put on her good dress and made coffee cake and set it on the table that Thomas had built, and she had felt, sitting across from Wallace in that room, not that she was betraying Thomas but that she was taking his measure of her seriously. Thomas had thought she was brave enough for this land. This was her proving him right. They were engaged by November. The announcement, when they made it in Caldwell Crossing, produced the full range of responses Augusta had expected. Mrs. Hargrove, whose opinions on the matter of widows remarrying were both swift and numerous, said 2 years was too soon. Carl Hess said it was about time and shook Wallace's hand with great enthusiasm. Reuben Gray, recovered from his heart episode and back to working part-time on Augusta's property, said simply that he was not surprised, in the tone of a man who had not been surprised since approximately 1871 and was not about to start now. What Augusta had not expected was the letter that arrived from Kansas in the 3rd week of November. It came addressed to Wallace in a hand she did not recognize, and she would not have thought anything of it except that she saw his face when he looked at it, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes that she had learned to read as something difficult being controlled rather than felt. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket and said it was from an old acquaintance in Dodge City, and she had nodded and said nothing. But the folding and the pocketing had the quality of a thing being hidden rather than simply set aside. She did not ask about it that evening. She believed in giving people the space to choose when to speak. But the letter sat in the back of her awareness like a stone in a boot, not agonizing but persistently present. He told her about it 4 days later. They were walking the creek path in the late afternoon, the cottonwoods bare now and the water running clear and cold over its stones, and he stopped walking and turned to face her, and said there was something she needed to know before they went further toward the wedding. She felt the particular stillness of a person bracing for revelation. She thought briefly and specifically of the word betrayal, which her mind offered up like a card from a deck she had been hoping not to draw. She said he should go ahead. He told her that when he had been working in Dodge City as a foreman, there had been a young woman named Clara Hennessy, the daughter of the cattleman who owned the outfit he worked for. They had been involved briefly, 2 years before he had left for the territory. He said that the relationship had been genuine on his part, but that it had ended badly, that Clara's father had discovered it, and had made his position on a foreman courting his daughter explosively clear, and that Wallace, who had understood the power dynamics of the situation with painful clarity, had removed himself from it. He said that Clara had been hurt by the way it ended, and that he had carried that as something he had handled badly, not the relationship itself, but the way he had allowed the ending to happen without enough honesty or courage. He said the letter was from Clara. She had heard he was engaged and had written to say she harbored him no ill will and wished him happiness. Augusta listened to all of this standing very still beside the cold creek with the bare cottonwood branches overhead, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the water. She was testing herself, she realized, checking the inside of her own chest the way you check the grain for damage, feeling for the particular texture of a betrayal against the texture of a truth told plainly. What she found was not betrayal. He had not hidden Clara Hennessy from her out of guilt or dishonesty. He had held it until he was sure of where they were going because he understood that a story from your past, dropped carelessly into the beginning of something tender, could do damage that was not proportional to the story itself. He had timed the telling with a care that was characteristic of him. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with the same directness he always brought to difficult things, not braced for her reaction but not indifferent to it either. She said she appreciated him telling her. She said she had no claim on his life before they met, but that she was glad he had not left her to wonder what the letter was. He said he would never leave her to wonder about anything he could tell her plainly. She believed him. Not naively, not because she was a romantic who believed what people said without reference to what they did, but because she had now been watching what Wallace Dalton did for 6 months, and the telling and the doing were consistent in him in a way she had come to trust. She reached for his hand, and he took hers, and they walked back along the creek path together in the cold November air. The wedding was set for the first week of February 1894. December brought heavy snow, unusual for the territory but not impossible, and they spent 2 weeks unable to travel between the properties. Augusta in her sod house and Wallace in his frame house 3 miles to the north, which was its own kind of education. She had expected the isolation to feel like confinement. Instead, she found herself looking north across the snow-covered land, toward his property, with a feeling that was pleasantly and inconveniently like longing. She wrote him letters, which was not something she had done since Thomas, and found that putting words on paper for Wallace Dalton required a different kind of honesty than the honesty of face-to-face conversation. She told him things in those letters that she had not known she needed to say until she found herself saying them. She told him that she was more frightened of being happy again than she had been of anything the territory had thrown at her, because the territory's hardships were impersonal, but happiness had a face and a name and could be taken. She said she knew this was irrational. His letter back said it was not irrational at all. It said that the things worth having were also the things that could be lost, and that the alternative to risking loss was a life that had very little worth having in it. He said he had not spent 14 years working for a piece of land just to be afraid to plant it. Augusta had read that letter 3 times at the kitchen table while the snow came down outside, and then she had put it very carefully in the box where she kept the things she wanted to keep. January thawed enough for regular travel, and they spent the month in the practical work of preparing for a life together. There were decisions to make about which property to call the primary home. Augusta had, without much internal debate, concluded that the sod house was a chapter that had been Thomas's as much as hers, and that living in it as a married woman with Wallace would be a confusion of things that deserved to be distinct. Wallace's frame house was larger, better built, and had a second room that could become, in time, a child's room. He had, without her asking, said that if she was willing, he would like to bring her to his place, and that they would make it hers in every way she wanted it. She had sold the sod house and property to a young couple newly arrived from Missouri, a man and his wife with a baby and a look of terrified determination that Augusta recognized from her own first year in the territory, and she had used the money to pay off the final portion of the property note she had been carrying. On the afternoon, she handed the bank's receipt to the young couple along with the property deed. She had felt something settle in her that she did not have a precise word for. It was the particular freedom of having carried a weight alone for a long time and finally, deliberately, setting it down. She kept the property around the elm tree. She had insisted on this point with the young couple from Missouri, and they had been willing enough, and so there was a small deeded reserve of land, perhaps a 1/4 acre, centered on Thomas Keene's grave beneath the elm tree. She told Wallace about it directly, on the evening she signed the papers, and he had said simply that that was right and he was glad she had done it. She had looked at him across the table in the Hess store where they had signed the deed, and felt a thing she would not have known how to articulate to anyone who had not been where she had been, the feeling of being loved by someone who was also large enough to love all the parts of you, including the parts that belonged to someone else. The wedding took place on February 3rd, 1894, in the small Presbyterian church in Caldwell Crossing, which held approximately 40 people when pressed, and was pressed considerably on that occasion. Augusta wore a dress she had made herself from deep blue wool, because she had not wanted white, which felt ceremonially dishonest for a second marriage, and a woman of 28 who had already buried one husband in the Oklahoma clay. But she had wanted something beautiful, and the deep blue was beautiful. She carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers that Reuben Gray had collected for her in the fall and kept all winter in a paper envelope. Wallace wore his best suit, which was a genuine suit, not simply dressed-up work clothes, dark gray and well-cut, and he stood at the front of the church with a stillness and a certainty that Augusta, walking toward him on Karl Hess's arm because she had no family near and Karl had offered with great eagerness, found entirely characteristic. He did not fidget. He watched her come toward him with the same complete, undemonstrative attention he had given everything that mattered to him, and when she reached him and took his hand, she felt the steadiness of that hand and thought of the ruined field and the morning light and the word they. And she understood that she had not simply arrived at a wedding, but at an ending of something that had been long and difficult and largely solitary, and a beginning of something else entirely. They said their vows plainly, without addition or elaboration, because they were both people who found the unembellished truth to be sufficient. The celebration afterward in the Hess store building, with Karl's wife having organized what seemed like most of the territory's available women to produce an entirely unreasonable quantity of food, was warm and loud and cheerful in a way that Augusta let herself enjoy without reservation. Mrs. Hargrove made a speech that contained at least 3 gentle suggestions that Augusta should not wait too long before producing an heir, which Augusta received with a smile that she had learned from 2 years of frontier life could function simultaneously as acknowledgement and dismissal. Reuben Gray drank more whiskey than was perhaps advisable and made a toast that was short and, for Reuben, extravagantly emotional, something about good people finding each other on hard ground. Wallace kept her hand in his for most of the evening. That was the thing she noticed, not the speeches or the food or the warmth of the crowded room. His hand around hers, steady and present, the way he had been present in the ruined field, without needing to make a point of it. They drove home to the frame house in the last of the February evening, the land flat and white around them and the stars very clear overhead, and Augusta looked at the house with its lit windows as they came up the track and thought it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. The first year of their marriage was, by any practical measure, hard. The spring of 1894 brought late frost that damaged the first planting and required reseeding, and the cattle market had a difficult season following overproduction in the previous year, and there was a dispute with a neighboring property to the west of Wallace's land, a man named Lyle Cutter who had been quietly encroaching on the western fence line for at least 2 seasons, and who, upon discovering that the Harlan property now had a new and observant owner, became suddenly and aggressively territorial about a surveying error that he claimed put 3 acres of Wallace's land within his original claim. The dispute with Cutter was, for several weeks in June, genuinely alarming. Cutter was not a violent man precisely, but he was the kind of man whose sense of having been wronged could curdle into something dangerous, and there were 2 evenings when he appeared at the fence line after dark with a lantern and a tone of voice that made Augusta, watching from the house, think carefully about where the Winchester was kept. Wallace handled Cutter with a thoroughness that Augusta found both reassuring and illuminating. He did not escalate. He did not threaten or bluster. He hired a surveyor from Guthrie at his own expense to produce a formal property survey and had the results recorded at the county courthouse, creating an unambiguous legal record of the boundary. He then went to Cutter's property during daylight hours and presented him with a copy of the survey results in person, alone, without aggression, speaking in the quiet, certain voice that acknowledged Cutter's grievance without conceding anything he was not prepared to give. Cutter had accepted the survey results with poor grace, but had accepted them. The fence line was corrected, and the matter was formally closed, and Lyle Cutter took to riding wide around the Dalton property's western edge for the rest of the season, which was a satisfactory outcome by frontier standards. Augusta had watched all of this and thought about dark pasts and hidden motives and the various ways men in this territory used power, and she had thought about the specific, particular quality of the man she had married, who was capable of force but chose clarity instead, and she had felt a warmth for him that was deeper and quieter than the earlier feeling, less trembling and more settled, the kind of love that has been tested and has confirmed itself. The wheat harvest in the fall of 1894 was good. Not spectacular, but genuinely good, the kind of harvest that allows you to look at the numbers and see a future in them. She made the first repayment on the loan in October, bringing the cash to him in the kitchen of the house they shared, which he received with a small smile and a slight shake of his head that suggested he had never really thought about the loan in the way a creditor thinks about debt. She said she thought of it and he was getting paid back properly. He said he understood, and he took the money and recorded it in the account book, and that was that. By October of 1894, Augusta knew she was expecting a child. She told Wallace on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the autumn sun coming through the window she had dressed with new curtains in the first week of their marriage. The deep gold curtains she had found at the dry goods store in Guthrie that had seemed to her, when she saw them, to be the exact color of what she was feeling. She had told him simply, directly, in the way she told him everything, and he had sat very still for a moment. And then he had gotten up from his chair and come around the table and crouched down in front of her where she sat, taking both her hands in his with a gentleness that was not his usual register of touch, a tenderness so undefended that it had made her eyes fill unexpectedly. He asked how she was feeling. She said she was terrified and happy, and that those were not incompatible. He said he knew. He kept her hands for a long moment in both of his, looking at her in the clear morning light, and then he said he was very glad. She had put her forehead against his briefly, there in the kitchen with the gold curtains and the sound of the territory quiet outside, and she had thought this exact thing. This is what I was afraid of losing, and it is here. The pregnancy was not easy. The territory was not, in 1894, a place that offered sophisticated medical care, and Augusta, who had already lost Thomas to the territory's indifference, was under no illusions about what could go wrong. She was sensible about it, eating well and working at a measured pace, and consulting the doctor in Guthrie at the appropriate intervals. But there was a thread of fear running beneath the practical management of her days that she kept mostly to herself, because she did not want to give it more air than it needed to breathe. Wallace saw it anyway. He was not a man who missed things about people he was paying attention to, and he was paying close attention. He did not press her to talk about it when she did not want to. He simply adjusted the work he asked of her imperceptibly, and made sure she was never alone for long and was there in the evenings when the fear was loudest, reading at the kitchen table or sitting with her on the porch in the last warm weeks of fall, his presence the same steady fact it had been in the ruined field. She told him once in November that she was afraid of losing him too. Not of him leaving, not that kind of afraid, but the other kind, the deep territory kind, the kind that comes from knowing that the land can take anyone at any time without warning. She told him she had been through it once, and she knew its exact dimensions, and that knowing made it, somehow, more frightening rather than less. He had listened to this with his full attention, and then said that he understood, and that he could not promise her the territory's mercy because no one had ever had that to promise. He said that what he could promise her was that he would give her no additional reasons to fear, that he would be careful not because he was afraid of dying but because he understood what it would cost her. He said that was not nothing. She said it was not nothing at all. Their son was born on April the 22nd, 1895, in the bedroom of the frame house on the Dalton property, with the doctor from Guthrie and a midwife named Sarah Birch, who had attended most of the births in the settlement for 15 years, and whose calm competence was exactly what Augusta needed in the worst hours of the night. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Wallace, who was not permitted in the room but who she could hear in the hallway at intervals, simply present, simply there, was where she drew whatever additional reserves she needed when her own were running thin. When Sarah Birch finally put the boy in her arms in the gray light of early morning, Augusta looked at him for a long moment and thought, with a clarity that felt enormous and clean, that this was what she had been building toward since the fourth morning after Thomas died, when she had gotten up to feed the horses. Not just survival, not just holding on. This. Wallace came in when they permitted him, looking like a man who had aged approximately 3 years in the course of a single night, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy with an expression Augusta had no word for in any language she knew. And then he looked at her, and his expression was exactly the same but more so. She asked if he had a preference for the name. He said he thought James was a good name, her father's name, which she had mentioned once in a letter during the December snow and which he had apparently kept. She said yes. James was right. James Wallace Dalton was, from his first day in the territory, an entirely definite person. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's way of occupying exactly the space he needed with absolute equanimity, and he was generally regarded by Reuben Gray, who visited frequently and considered himself the boy's honorary grandfather, to be the finest-looking child born in the Oklahoma Territory since statehood was decided, which was admittedly still a few years off. The second repayment of the loan was made in the fall of 1895, and the third and final payment in the spring of 1896, which officially closed the debt and left Augusta with something she had not had since before Thomas's death: clean, unencumbered ownership of her financial position. She had asked Wallace to record the final payment in the account book with the same formal care they had given the other two, and when he drew the final line through the balance and set down his pen, she had picked up the account book and looked at the cleared column for a long moment and then set it down. She said she had a proposal for him. He had looked at her with the slight lift of an eyebrow that was his version of expressing surprised attention. She said she had been thinking about the eastern lower quarter of the original Keene property, the 15 acres that had survived the hailstorm of 1893, the land she had planted year after year since then with hired seasonal help, and which produced a modest but consistent yield. She said that with the loan repaid, she wanted to fold that parcel formally into the Dalton property and farm it together as a single operation, rather than the slightly awkward adjacent but separate arrangement they had been managing. Wallace had looked at her for a moment, and then said that he thought that was a very good idea, and that he should tell her that he had been thinking the same thing for some months, but had not wanted to suggest it, because he thought she might need to be the one to raise it. Augusta had looked at him, and thought about how he was, in this particular way, deeply infuriating and deeply right simultaneously, which was a combination she had come to recognize as characteristic of loving someone who knew you well. She said he could have said something. He said he could have, but had chosen not to. She said she supposed she appreciated it and would be grateful if he could manage to be slightly less perceptive in future, as it was occasionally inconvenient. He had laughed. He had a laugh that she loved particularly because he did not use it casually, and so when it came it had the quality of something genuinely meant, and she thought every time she heard it that she would like to keep hearing it for as long as possible. They formally merged the properties in the spring of 1896, creating the Dalton operation that would, over the following years, become one of the better regarded farming and cattle operations in the northern part of the territory. This was not an accident. It was the result of two people who had both come to this land separately and hard, and who knew, with particular specificity, what it cost and what it could give. Oklahoma Territory became the state of Oklahoma in November of 1907, and Augusta and Wallace Dalton, with 11-year-old James and his younger brother Henry, who had arrived in 1898 with exactly the same calm certainty his father had always displayed, and their daughter Clara, named freely and happily for no historical reason, except that it was a name Augusta had always loved, and that Wallace had smiled at with a quiet warmth when she suggested it. Drove into Caldwell Crossing for the statehood celebration, and stood together in the main street as the news was read aloud, and people cheered around them in the November cold. Augusta stood with Wallace's arm around her shoulders and James, and Henry jostling each other on her left, and Clara with her dark hair in neat braids holding her father's other hand, and she looked at the clear Oklahoma sky above the familiar rooftops of Caldwell Crossing and thought about the morning of August the 17th, 1893, when she had stood at the edge of a ruined field and wept, and a man she barely knew had come and stood beside her without a word. She thought about what she had been then and what she was now, and the road between those 2 points was so full, so various, so unexpectedly rich with the specific texture of days lived alongside a person who had chosen to stay, that she could not hold it all in mind at once. She could only hold the fact of it, the accumulated weight and warmth of it. Wallace leaned down and said something in her ear that was lost in the crowd noise, but that she understood from the warmth of his voice and the press of his arm. She leaned into him and let the celebration move around them. James Dalton was 17 in 1912, a broad-shouldered young man who had Thomas Keene's old Winchester and could use it competently for hunting, who had his father's way with horses and his mother's way with numbers, and who had recently announced that he wanted to study agricultural science at the university in Norman, which Augusta supported with a ferocity that surprised even her, and which Wallace funded by expanding the cattle operation in the 2 years before James left, ensuring the income would be there. Henry, at 14, was the one who was going to stay on the land. Augusta knew this with the same certainty she knew which wheat would come up strong and which would need replanting. Henry had the land in him the way the original settlers had it, not as an ambition, but as a fundamental orientation. He worked alongside his father from the time he could hold a fence post steady, and he asked questions about soil and weather and animal breeding with an intensity that was entirely his own, and that Wallace answered with quiet thoroughness. Clara, at 9, was reading everything she could find and had recently developed strong opinions about women's suffrage, which was being widely discussed and was the cause of considerable debate in the state's political circles. She had delivered, at the family supper table, a speech on the subject of equal civic participation that had left James with his mouth open, Henry mildly confused, and both Augusta and Wallace working very hard not to demonstrate how deeply pleased they were. Augusta had told Wallace afterward, in their room in the evening, that she thought their daughter was going to be either a politician or a lawyer. Wallace had said he thought probably both. On the occasion of their 20th wedding anniversary, in February of 1914, James came back from Norman for the occasion, and Henry and Clara were there. And Reuben Gray, now 84 years old and comprehensively unbowed by the fact, made the trip from Caldwell Crossing, where he had been living with his daughter for 7 years. And Carl Hess, who had sold his store to his son but still appeared regularly at community occasions, was there. And they had a dinner that Augusta cooked herself because she had never much trusted anyone else's biscuits. After dinner, when the young people had cleared the table and Reuben Gray had fallen asleep in the good chair by the stove in the way of a man who had earned his rest, Augusta and Wallace stepped out onto the porch, which was now a proper covered porch running the full length of the front of the house that Wallace and Henry had built out 2 summers ago, and stood in the February cold with the stars very clear over the flat land. Augusta looked out at the property in the dark, the wheat fields dormant under their winter mulch, the cattle shapes in the east pasture, the lights of Caldwell Crossing visible faintly to the south, and thought about 20 years of this, 20 years of seasons and harvests and hard winters and good ones, 3 children and 1 loan repaid, and a fence line corrected, and a letter from Kansas, and a dispute with Lyle Cutter, who had eventually sold his property and moved to Texas, and the elm tree on the rise 3 miles south that she still visited several times a year, because Thomas Keene deserved to be remembered even by a woman who had built a whole life beyond the loss of him. Wallace was looking at the same dark land. She said after a while that she could not have imagined it in that first year, that any of this was possible. He said he had thought, from about the 3rd conversation they had had over the fence line in the summer of 1893, that something of this kind was inevitable, though he had tried very hard not to think that for reasons he hoped she understood. She said she understood entirely. She had been doing exactly the same trying. He said they had both been very bad at it. She said they had. She said she was grateful for that particular failure. He put his arm around her on the porch, the way he had stood at her shoulder in the ruined field, close without constraint, warm and certain and present, the same quality of presence that had undone her that first morning, that she had come to know as the most reliable fact of her life. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, looking out at the dark Oklahoma land that had broken her once and rebuilt her differently, that had taken Thomas and given her Wallace, that had destroyed her harvest and made the space for everything that followed. She was 49 years old now, and she had crossed half a continent and buried her first husband and fought the territory for her property and her livelihood and her right to remain standing on this particular ground. And she had found, against her careful, deliberate expectations, the thing she had not thought she was allowed to want twice. Not the same love, something different. Something that had grown specifically from this land and these years, and the particular accumulation of mud and hailstorms and fence-line conversations, and letters written in December snow, and a morning in a ruined field, when a man she barely knew had come and stood beside her without a word. She reached up and found his hand on her shoulder and held it. Inside the house, Clara's laugh rose above the low sound of conversation, bright and decisive, the laugh of a girl who was not interested in a world that expected her to be smaller than she was. James's voice followed it, older, already starting to have the considered quality of his father. Henry's was quieter, already attentive in the way he would be his whole life, to weather and soil and the people around him. Augusta listened to her children in the warm house and felt the cold, clean air on her face and held her husband's hand. The wheat would come up in the spring. It always did, eventually. The land took and the land gave, and the taking did not mean the end and the giving did not mean the safety, but the growing was real and the harvest was real, and the warmth of a person beside you in the cold was real. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that this enormous, ungovernable, beautiful, brutal territory had ever asked of her or given her, distilled to this moment, this porch, this hand in hers, this life. Augusta Keene Dalton, who had once stood at the edge of a ruined field and wept with nothing left in her that believed in good things, held on. The stars came out one by one over the Oklahoma land. The house behind her was full of light.